In Chapter 9, we're going to continue the discussion about audit sampling, specifically looking at an application to substantive test of account balances. Remember back in Chapter 8, it was the focus was on applications to test of controls. Now we're off test of controls, focusing on substantive tests. Substantive tests is where we're providing tests of details of account balances. The statistical concepts that were discussed in the last chapter will apply to this chapter as well. So there's three very important determinants that will be used to determine sample size, and they are your desired confidence level, tolerable misstatement, and estimated misstatement, as well as population plays a bigger role in some of the sampling techniques used for substantive tests. We need to remember that. Misstatements discovered in the audit sample will be projected to the entire population. So there has to be an allowance for sampling risk. Okay, and let me get my glasses. I'm on page 302 and 303 of your book. So on those pages, we're talking about this allowance for sampling risk. You must allow for risk when sampling. Okay, so we have this component now in our determinations and observations and evaluations. So consider the following information about an inventory account balance, and this is the one that is presented on those pages. You have a book value of inventory of $3 million. You sample that inventory balance, and the amount you sampled, the book value of that inventory is $100,000. You audit it, and you find out that same inventory has an audited value of $98,000. The total amount of overstated observed in audit sample is $2,000. So what this is saying is that, okay, in our sample, which is much smaller than our population, 2% of it is misstated. So apply that 2% to the entire population. So it provides an estimate that the inventory is misstated by $60,000, or 2% of the entire population of 3 million. So the results of our audit test depend upon what can we tolerate as a misstatement. If the tolerable misstatement is $50,000, we cannot conclude that inventory is fairly stated, because our projected misstatement, 60, is greater than the tolerable misstatement. So keeping that in mind, we need to use sampling techniques. So we looked at some sampling for test of controls. For substantive tests, monetary unit sampling is one of the most commonly used sampling techniques. And the reason is because it expresses a monetary conclusion rather than a rate of occurrence. Last chapter it was rate of occurrence. Here we want to know a monetary conclusion. So it is our commonly used sampling technique to test accounts, such as accounts receivable, loans receivable, investment securities, and inventory. So monetary unit sampling uses the attribute sampling theory, like we did in the last chapter, to estimate the percentage, what percentage of monetary units in the population might be misstated, and then multiplies that percentage by an estimate of how much the dollars are misstated. So, what are the advantages of using this type of sampling? when the auditor expects little misstatement, and usually in an account there isn't a lot of misstatement. MUS usually results in a smaller sample size than normal sampling, classical variable sampling. When applied using what we call the probability proportional to size procedure, which you'll see, MUS automatically results in a stratified sample, the kind we want. And monetary unit sampling does not require the user to make assumptions about the distribution of misstatements. Some disadvantages: the selection of zero or negative balances in like customer accounts generally requires special design considerations, because you'll see it's only picking up items with a monetary value above zero. When more than a few misstatements are detected, the sample results calculations may overstate or provide for too much allowance for sampling risk. So there are some disadvantages to it. So if you look on page 304, with regards to that second statement, why does this occur? Why would there be an overstatement of allowance risk? And it says this occurs because the methods used to determine the amount of misstatements are conservative. Thus, an auditor is more likely to reject an acceptable recorded book value in overall audit because of how careful we are. So, we err on the side of caution in accounting and auditing. So how do we do this? So we're going to look at the steps, and we're going to look at an example here. First of all, determine what our objectives are. So sampling may be used for substantive testing to test the reasonableness of assertions about a financial statement amount. It's accurate, it exists. Okay, and this is the most common use for sampling for substantive testing. And then develop an estimate of some amount. Define the population characteristics and make sure you define it correctly. For monetary unit sampling, the population is defined as the monetary value of an account balance. Define the sampling unit. An individual dollar represents one sampling unit. And then define a misstatement. A misstatement is defined as the difference between the monetary unit in the records and the amounts you found by auditing. Okay, let's see if there's anything I want to point out there to you. Okay, define a misstatement. Okay, so if we're on page 306, a clear misstatement, this is under define a misstatement. A clear misstatement definition is important because definitions that are too narrow or too broad may result in inefficient or ineffective testing. So you're going to do too much, or the testing you do isn't doing what it's supposed to. Example: if an accounts receivable confirmation letter from a customer reports a difference between what the customer says and the entity's record, it would be considered a misstatement, unless it would not be considered a misstatement if the difference is inexplainable and supported by circumstances such as timing. Okay, so we got to be careful of that kind of stuff. That's what we're talking about there. What is a misstatement? Determine the sample size using these inputs: the desired confidence level or acceptable risk of incorrect acceptance. So the risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that the sample supports the conclusion that the recorded account balance is fairly stated when it's not. So how confident are we in that? Tolerable misstatement. How much is the maximum amount, we know this, which the account can be misstated and accepted by the auditor? Expected misstatement. It's the dollar amount of misstatement that the auditor believes exists in the population. So it's what is expected. And then the population size. So we use these inputs to determine it. And a great table on the bottom of page 307 tells us how these items affect sample size. So let's take a second. Desired confidence level. There's a direct impact on the sample size. The lower the desired confidence level, so if you lower it, it decreases the sample size. If you higher, you want more confidence, you increase it. If your tolerable misstatement, though, is lowered, you increase the sample size because you want to make sure you're sampling enough. If you higher the tolerable misstatement, you'll decrease the sample size. If your expected misstatement is lowered, then you'll decrease your sample size. If it's higher, your expected misstatement, you expect more misstatements, you want to make sure you sample more. As your population size decreases or is lowered, so does your sample size. If your population size is higher, your sample size increases. So it's just showing you the relationship of these different items and how they impact the sample size. And there it is again on this slide. That's what we just looked at. The next step is performance. Select your sample items. The auditor selects a sample for a monetary unit sampling by using what we call a systematic selection approach called probability proportional to size. Probability proportional to size. The sampling interval is determined by dividing the book value of the population by the sample size. So first figure out your sample size based on those variables. Then divide it into the book value of the population. Each individual dollar in a population has an equal chance of being selected. And items, or what we call logical units, greater than the interval will always be selected. Always. For example, assume the book value of accounts receivable is $2,500,000, and the auditor said there needs to be a sample size of 93. The sampling interval will be 26,882. A random number is selected to begin selecting the sample, and that is 3977. So here's how the auditor would select the samples. Which items? They'll go to the accounts receivable balance that starts at 3977. So first you're going to list all your customers in some kind of order. Go to $39.77. Well, $39.77 is in Admington Hospital. The first $23.50 is in AC emergency. The monetary unit, or that logical unit, $39.77 then, would be within Admington Hospital. So let's see here. So we have 23, other class, okay, $23.50 minus $39.77. Okay, so the first $1,627 of Admington Hospital would be $39.77 amount. Okay. Now add 26,882. Okay, let me just double check something. Okay. Oh boy, okay, 2682. Sorry, just bear with me a second. I should have done this before I started this presentation, but I didn't. Okay, the next interval of 26882 will appear in Good Hospital Corporation. So we just keep going, and as you can see all the way over on the right, it says, okay, and that should be a plus, not a divided by. 3997 plus 26882 will be where the dollar, 3997, that's a little off, would be at the dollar amount where it's at 30,879. So it is in Good Hospital Corporation. That's where the $30,879 of accounts receivables is at. Now add 26,882 to the 30,879, and we get 57,761. Well, that dollar amount will be within this 32,549 balance of Zippy Corp. So we're basing our selection following the cumulative dollars, and whenever the next 26,882 dollar appears, that item will be selected. That's in the sample. Now perform your auditing procedures. So whatever auditing procedures you decide to do, so after the sample items have been selected, the auditor conducts the planned audit procedure on the units in the sample. Okay. And then we're ready to evaluate. We collect the information we got from the audit procedure. Calculate the projected misstatement and the upper limit on misstatement. So this is discussed on page 310. The projection of the error to the population. So what's the entire error? That's your projected misstatement. The upper misstatement limit adds in an allowance for sampling risk to your projected misstatement. Okay, and they talk about in IDEA, your software, they have different names for those items, so make sure you're aware of them. But they're following that same line of thinking. So let's take a look at an example here. Your book value of this particular item is $2,500,000, accounts receivable. Your tolerable misstatement has been determined to be $125,000. You have a sample size of 93. Your confidence level is at 95%. So you want a desired confidence level of 95%. Your expected amount of misstatement is 25,000. Your sampling interval is 26,882. Okay. What we need to determine is first basic precision. Okay, and that's discussed on the bottom of page 310. The allowance for sampling risk when no misstatements are observed is referred to as basic precision, and you'll use a table to determine that. So if there's no misstatements in your sample, the best estimate of the population misstatement would be $0. However, okay, we want to make sure we're calculating that information correctly and calculating an upper misstatement limit correctly. So take a look at the table. This is our monetary unit sampling misstatements. And this is on page 311. If we want a 90% confidence level, the number of errors we find are 0. The misstatement factor we use to find our overall misstatement limit, upper misstatement limit, because this will have sampling risk, will be 2.3 times our sampling interval. If we have 3 errors, I'm sorry, not 3 errors. If we want a 95% confidence level, which is the case here, desired confidence level is 95%. We have 0 errors found during our sampling. Multiply that by the sampling interval, and that's our upper misstatement limit, which would be 80,646. In the sample of 93 items, the following misstatements were found. There's our book value and our audit value and the difference. Okay. We then compute what's called a tainting factor. All we do is take the difference between our book value and our audit value and divide it by our book value. So the tainting factor for customer 1 would be 15%, 2, 40%, and 3, 100%. And 4 wouldn't matter. Let me see. 4 would. Why? 4 wouldn't, we wouldn't be as concerned because that will be fully audited. Okay, that will be audited more just because of the size of the dollar amount of that item. Now, and that's because the ACC balance is greater than the interval, no sampling risk is added. Since all the dollars in the large accounts are audited, there's no sampling risk associated with large accounts. So we want to compute that upper misstatement limit for these other accounts. We'll compute that by taking the basic precision and ranking those detected misstatements based on the size of the tainting factor from the largest to the smallest. So we have our basic precision, we have our tainting factor. So basic precision is 1 for Learnhardt Centers, 40% for Marva, 15% for Good Hospital. Here's our sampling interval. Multiply your sampling interval by the tainting factor discovered. Then we take the incremental increase in that 95% desired confidence level table. For instance, when you have 0 mistakes to 1 mistake, your misstatement factor increases 1.7. So now we'll multiply the projected misstatement by the 1.7 upper limit incremental increase in misstatement factor. That's our sampling risk. 45,700 then is our upper misstatement for that customer. Marva Medicals, 40% times the sampling interval. So the tainting factor by the sampling interval gives us our projected misstatement times the next increase when we find 2 errors. So there's our first error, our second error, our third error. 1.5%, 16,130. Good Hospital had a 15% tainting factor. Multiply that by the sampling interval and then multiply it by the incremental increase on page 311 for the third error, which would go up to 1.4 with a 95% desired confidence level. 5645. Our basic precision, the very first one, is always 100 times the sampling interval. There's no projected misstatement, so the upper misstatement is 80,000 times 3, because that's our very first with 0 misstatements. So now we add up 80,646 plus 45,700 plus 16,130 plus 5645. And the ACC difference, there is no sampling risk, so we just add in the actual misstatement we found. So the upper misstatement calculation in total would be 150,621. The projected misstatement is 44,167. That's how you find your upper misstatement using monetary unit sampling. Based on the information, then you'll have to draw a final conclusion. In our example, the final decision is whether the accounts receivable balance is materially misstated or not. So we compare the tolerable misstatement to the upper misstatement limit. If that upper misstatement limit is less than or equal to the tolerable misstatement, we can conclude that the balance is not materially misstated. In our example, the upper misstatement limit of 156.21 is greater than the tolerable misstatement for that account of 125,000. So that's how we would use all of that calculation we just did to determine if the account is materially misstated. So when faced with this situation, what does the auditor do? They increase their sample size. We got to look at more. We'll do other kind of tests. We may just ask the entity to adjust accounts receivables so that that misstatement is not there. And if management refuses to adjust the account when it's needed to be, the auditor should consider issuing a qualified or adverse opinion. So we have risk when evaluating our account balances. Remember, our auditor's decision is based on our evidence. Does it support the fairness of the account balance? If that's true, true statement of financial statement account, not materially misstated, then that's your correct decision. If the true statement of financial is materially misstated, you have a risk of incorrect acceptance. So if you feel, after evaluating, comparing your tolerable misstatement to your upper limit misstatement, that it supports the fairness, that it is not materially misstated, you run the risk of accepting it when it's materially misstated. So a risk of incorrect acceptance. If instead you come back and say it does not support the fairness of the account balance, then you run the risk of incorrect rejection, saying, okay, we got to do more audit procedures. So that's the risk involved when you're evaluating your account balances based on your sampling. So sometimes this method is not effective in determining understatement misstatements. So monetary unit is not particularly effective at detecting understatements. An understated account is less likely to be selected than an overstated account. The most likely error here will be reduced by 2688. Because of this, take a look. They found book value was $2,000, audit value $2,200. It was understated by $2,000, or negative 10%. So errors may be reduced by understating. So you got to keep that in mind as well. Now, on page 316, there's a nice little, following that what we were just looking at, example showing you the effect of these understated accounts. Okay, and in the example, down at the bottom of page 316, it says some auditors also adjust down the upper limit by the projected understatement to obtain a new misstatement amount, and then compare that to tolerable misstatement. So that's a use you can have with this understatement misstatement. It's crazy, huh? But this is how we do it in auditing. All right, moving on. Another sampling technique, non-statistical sampling for tests of account balances. This sampling is unit for non-statistical sampling is normally a customer account, an individual transaction, or a line item on a transaction. So before we were looking at balances in accounts, now we're looking at specific items within the account. So when you're using non-statistical sampling, the following items must be considered. Are there individually significant items? What is the proper sample size? How do we select the sampled items? And then calculating our sampling results. So identifying the individually significant items. The items to be tested individually are items that may contain potential misstatements that individually exceed the tolerable misstatement. So these items are tested 100% because they're not, the auditor says there's no sampling risk involved with these. For instance, here's what we do. We will take our sampling population book value and divide it by our tolerable error minus our expected misstatement. Then multiply that by a confidence level based on our assessment of risk of material misstatement. Auditing standards require that the sample items be selected in such a way that the sample can be expected to represent the population. Take a look on page 320. Let's look at an example here. Calabro Wireless. The auditors decided to use non-statistical sampling on the accounts receivable balance. As of December 31st, there were 11,800 accounts receivables in total. 15 of them were greater than 25,000. 250 of the accounts are greater than 3,000, and less than 11,535 are less than 3,000. The auditor has decided, based on the test of controls and the risk of material misstatement, and it's being assessed as low. The tolerable misstatement for accounts receivable is 55,000. The expected is 15,000. The desired level of confidence is moderate based on other audit evidence. All customer balances greater than 25,000 are being audited. They're taken out of the sample or out of the population. They're not even going to be included. So of the balance, go to the top of the page. Of the balance in accounts receivable, subtract out the 550,000. They're not going to be a part of our population to sample. We're just going to audit them. The remaining 3,167,900, we divide that by our tolerable misstatement minus expected times our confidence level. Desired level of confidence is moderate. Assessment of risk is low, so 1.2, and that's right from our table in front of us. So there should be 95 items in the sample. 95. Okay. Give me 1 second here. Okay. I just wanted to bring us up to, here we are. So that's what I was just talking about. That's what I was just talking about. And that's what I was just talking about. So now, how do we get our sample? Well, the auditor sent positive confirmations to each of the 110 accounts selected. So we go about selecting, make sure we do it according to a good method of selecting our accounts, usually random, and we want to make sure we select enough in each individual group to represent the population. 4 customers indicated that their accounts were overstated, and the auditors determined that the misstatements were the results of unintentional error by entity personnel. Here are the results. You see the book value of each, the audit value of each, and the amount of overstatement. Overstatement. Okay, our audit value is lower than each book value. As a result of the audit procedures, the following projected misstatement was prepared. So, since all of the items in the greater than 25,000 category were tested, that is your projected misstatement, what you actually found. But since of the 3,000, the items that were greater than 3,000, you found a tolerable, or actual amount of misstatement of 2,000. Take the 2,000 divided by the dollar amount that you actually audited. So you would need to know the total customer balances that were audited, 425,000. That percentage of that sample total is the projected misstatement. For those items that were less than 3,000, there was $250 found. Divide the $250 by the dollar amount in your sample, 92,000. And then multiply that percentage by the total population in that stratum or category, the $2,317,400. And that's your projected misstatement for those items in that category, less than 3,000. Add up all your projected misstatements. The total projected misstatement is 10,800, and it's less than your expected misstatement. So the auditors may conclude that there's an acceptably low risk that the true misstatement exceeds the tolerable misstatement. So it seems like it's within the range it should be. Okay. So those were the 2 major types of sampling I wanted to go over on this voice PowerPoint. You are able to read through the the advanced modules 1 and 2, and if you have any kind of questions on them, please make sure you ask. But normally with substantive testing, you're looking at monetary unit sampling and non-statistical sampling, and these other sampling techniques are available but not as used as much just because of the nature of them. Thanks, and post any questions or email me.